The apartment that washed back the winter air of January 2024 in Lahore carried a heaviness that clung to the skin, an unsettling stillness that seemed to mute even the constant hum of the city. A young journalist, Adil, had just moved into a narrow two-bedroom apartment on the fifth floor of an aging complex, known to locals as the Crescent Flats. The building was infamous for its unreliable power and crumbling walls, but its low rent was irresistible. On his first night, he sat at his desk drafting an article, the faint orange glow of a dying streetlight filtering through his thin curtains. That was when he noticed it, the sensation of being watched. At first, he blamed his paranoia, but when he turned toward the window, he swore he saw the shadow of a figure pressed against the glass, though he lived far too high for anyone to stand there. The following evenings only deepened the unease. Every night, at exactly 2:47 a.m., Adil would awaken to the same sound, 3 slow knocks against the hollow walls of his bedroom. At first, he convinced himself it was a neighbor or the pipes. Yet when he asked around the next day, no one else claimed to hear them. Old buildings make strange noises, his landlord said dismissively. But Adil began to keep count, writing down the knocks in his notebook. Strangely, the pattern repeated. 3 knocks, silence, then a whisper too faint to catch. What unsettled him most wasn't just the sound itself, but the growing feeling that the knocks were deliberate, almost as if they were waiting for him to answer point one night. Desperate for proof, Adil set up his phone to record video as he slept. When he checked the footage the next morning, he felt his stomach sink. At precisely 2:47 a.m., the phone screen flickered, the microphone capturing faint static followed by 3 sharp knocks. But worse, he froze when he saw a frame where the camera lens seemed to distort. For only a second, a pale hand appeared at the edge of his bed, fingers curling around the mattress as though someone, or something, was climbing up from beneath. Yet when Adil pulled away his blankets and checked under the bed, nothing was there. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, like a graveyard after rain. By the end of the week, Adil's exhaustion had begun to show. Dark circles ringed his eyes, his writing slowed, and he jumped at even the faintest noises. Still, he couldn't bring himself to leave. Instead, he decided to confront the presence. On the 7th night, when the 3 knocks came, he whispered into the dark, "What do you want?" For the first time, there was a reply. A low, rasping voice seeped through the silence. Its words unclear, but its intent unmistakable. It was calling his name. His entire body froze, sweat sliding down his neck as the voice repeated, "Closer this time." Adil. The sound wasn't coming from the walls or the window. It was coming from inside the apartment, no more than a breath away from his ear. The next morning, Adil packed his belongings and left the Crescent Flats, abandoning the cheap rent and his unfinished articles. He never returned for his deposit, never looked back at the cracked building. Weeks later, when he told his story to friends, one of them admitted knowing a grim rumor. Years before, a tenant had been found dead in that very unit, their body discovered beneath the bed, hands curled upward as if they had tried to claw their way out. The detail was never printed in the papers, but neighbors whispered about it for years. For Adil, the truth no longer mattered. He already knew what he had heard, and what had tried to climb back into his world. The highway silence. It was the last week of February 2024 when Saima, a university student, found herself driving alone from Islamabad to her family home in Abbottabad. The trip usually took under 2 hours, but this night stretched unnaturally long. The highway was quiet, eerily so. No headlights appeared behind her, and no vehicles passed from the opposite direction. Even the gas stations she knew should be lit were swallowed in complete darkness. She turned up the radio for comfort, but it was only static, no matter which station she tried. The loneliness of the open road gnawed at her nerves, but she pressed on, convincing herself it was just an unusual night. At an hour into the drive, Simon noticed something strange in her rearview mirror. A faint glimmer of headlights flickered at the far distance, but they didn't behave normally. They didn't seem to draw closer or fade away, always remaining the same distance behind her. At times, they blinked, as if someone was signaling, but when she slowed, they slowed too. The more she tried to ignore it, the heavier the dread became. It was as if the lights weren't headlights at all, but something mimicking them, keeping her in sight deliberately. Her throat went dry, and she whispered prayers under her breath, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. Finally, desperate to put distance between herself and whatever followed, Sima pressed harder on the accelerator. For a few tense minutes, her car surged forward through the bends and stretches of the road. Yet when she dared to glance back, the lights were still there, steady, unwavering, impossible. Then, without warning, they vanished completely. The road behind her was swallowed by blackness. Relief came for only a breath, until she realized something worse. The interior of her car had grown unbearably cold, her breath now visible in the dim glow of her dashboard. The silence deepened, so absolute she couldn't even hear the engine anymore. It was as if the world had muted itself, leaving her alone in an empty shell. Moments later, she saw it. Standing on the shoulder of the road ahead was a figure, tall, lean, unnaturally still. As her headlights swept across its shape, she realized with horror that it wasn't facing her, but facing away, staring into the darkness of the trees. She slowed instinctively, unsure whether to stop or swerve past, when the figure suddenly snapped its head toward her, impossibly fast. Its face wasn't fully human, stretched and blurred, with eyes that glowed faintly white like the reflection of a predator's in the night. Heart pounding, she slammed her foot on the gas, swerving around it. For a fleeting second, she saw in her mirror that the figure was standing directly in the center of the road where she had just been. Watching her speed away at upbeat dawn, Sima finally reached her family's home. Shaken and pale, she collapsed into her mother's arms, insisting she would never again drive that road at night. Days later, she learned through hushed conversation that others had reported similar experiences in early 2024. Travelers speaking of endless stretches of silent road, strange lights tailing them, and figures appearing in the dark. Some never made it to their destinations. Official reports called them accidents, but families whispered that something on that highway didn't want people passing through alive. For Sima, it wasn't a matter of belief anymore. She knew the silence that lived there, waiting. The voice behind the door in March of 2024, a software engineer named Fahad rented a small house in Karachi's old district. The place was modest but quiet, tucked into a narrow lane where neighbors knew each other by name. He lived alone, enjoying the solitude, until one night when a peculiar incident shattered his comfort. Just after midnight, as he prepared to sleep, Fahad heard someone knock gently at his front door. It wasn't alarming at first. His neighbors sometimes asked for help when power outages struck, but when he opened it, there was no one there. Only the dark, silent lane stretched ahead, not a single figure in sight. A stray cat darted past his feet, and he closed the door, brushing it off as a prank. The next night, it happened again. This time the knock came later, close to 3 a.m. It was softer, drawn out, almost rhythmic. Cautiously, Fahad called out, "Who's there?" The reply came instantly, a woman's voice, muffled by the door. "It's me. Please, let me in." A chill ran down his spine. The voice was strangely familiar, though he couldn't place it. He pressed his ear to the wood, but when he looked through the peephole, the lane was empty once more. He stepped back, his heart pounding, and refused to open the door. After several minutes of silence, he gathered the courage to check again. Nothing. Just the faint hum of distant streetlights. Over the next week, the knocking escalated. It happened at the same time every night, always followed by the same woman's voice. What unsettled Fahad most was how the voice began to change. At first, it had been pleading, almost polite. Soon it grew urgent, desperate, and finally angry. On the fifth night, when he ignored the knocks, the voice hissed, "Why won't you let me in?" The sound scraped against the wood like nails. He blocked the door with furniture, trembling as the knocking grew louder, faster, shaking the frame as though something far stronger than a person was on the other side. Yet no neighbor reported hearing anything unusual, and when he checked his security camera the next morning, the footage showed nothing. No visitor, no knocks, no sound at all. On the seventh night, Fahad broke. The knocking began, and the voice returned, softer this time, coaxing. "I'm cold, Fahad. Please, you know me. Open the door." His chest tightened. The voice was no longer just familiar. It was identical to his late sister's, who had died in 2021. He stood frozen, tears stinging his eyes, his mind torn between grief and terror. His sister could not be at his door. And yet, the voice was hers. When he whispered, "What do you want?" the reply came chillingly clear, "I want to come back." The sound seeped through the cracks of the door like breath on glass. Something pressed against the wood from the other side, bending it inward slightly, as if testing the frame. By dawn, the knocking finally ceased. Fahad left the house the next day and never returned, abandoning his belongings entirely. The landlord later revealed a grim detail. Years earlier, a woman had died just outside that very door, her body left unattended for hours before discovery. Since then, some tenants had complained of strange knocks, but no one had stayed long enough for it to become a pattern. Fahad's experience spread among his friends as a whispered warning. If you hear a loved one's voice behind your door at 3 a.m., never open it. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. The last passenger in April 2024, Hamza worked as a late-night bus driver in Rawalpindi, running the midnight route across the city. The job was quiet, the roads nearly empty, and most nights passed without incident. One particular night, as the clock neared 1:30 a.m., Hamza pulled up to a small, dimly lit bus stop near an abandoned marketplace. To his surprise, a lone passenger waited there, a young woman in a pale dress, her hair hanging damply around her face. She stepped aboard without a word, dropped her fare in the box, and sat at the very back. Hamza gave a polite nod in the mirror, but she didn't look up. The bus rolled on through the deserted streets, its engine humming against the silence. After a few stops, Hamza noticed something odd. No matter how he adjusted the rearview mirror, he couldn't quite see the woman's face. The light seemed to fall around her rather than on her, as though she carried her own shadow. Still, she sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Every so often, Hamza thought he saw her lips moving, whispering something to herself, though no sound reached him. The longer she sat there, the heavier the bus felt, like the air itself thickened. About 20 minutes later, Hamza reached her supposed destination, one of the last stops on his route, near a cluster of closed shops. He slowed the bus and glanced back. "This is the stop," he called. The woman didn't move. He waited, cleared his throat, and tried again louder. Still nothing. Irritated, he rose from his seat and walked down the aisle. But when he reached the back, the seat was empty. No footprints, no sound of the door opening, nothing. The coin she had dropped into the fare box was gone too, as if she had never been there. His chest tightened, a cold shiver creeping over his skin. Just as he turned to retreat to the driver's seat, a whisper brushed against his ear, though he stood alone. "Next stop." Hamza spun around, but the bus was empty. His trembling hands gripped the poles as he hurried back to the front. He started the engine, but the rearview mirror betrayed him. She was there again, sitting in the very back, her head slowly lifting. For the first time, he saw her face. It was pale, waterlogged, and bruised, her lips cracked as if she had been pulled from a river. She was smiling. Hamza abandoned the bus that night, leaving it idling by the roadside until another driver found it. Later, he learned of a drowning accident that had occurred in 2019 not far from that very route. A woman whose body had been pulled from the water, her final bus ticket still clutched in her hand. Since then, drivers whispered of the last passenger, a spirit that boarded late-night buses, riding until someone acknowledged her. Hamza quit the job weeks later, but he could never shake the feeling that if he had driven just one more stop, she might not have left the bus at all. The patient in room 309 inches, May 2024, a young nurse named Rabia began her first night shift at a private hospital in Lahore. The building was modern but oddly quiet, its long white corridors humming with fluorescent light. That night, she was assigned to the third floor, a ward reserved for long-term patients. As she made her rounds, one room caught her attention, room 309. The door was slightly ajar, though her log showed it should be empty. Pushing it open, she found the room dimly lit, the curtains drawn, and the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with something damp and earthy. At first glance, the bed appeared occupied. A figure lay beneath the sheets, breathing slowly, as though asleep. Confused, she checked her list again. Room 309 was not assigned. Uneasy, Rabia approached the bed and gently called out, "Hello." The figure didn't stir. She leaned closer, pulling back the curtain that shielded the bed. For a fleeting moment, she caught sight of a pale face, lips blue, eyes closed as though in deep sleep. Her instincts told her the patient was unwell, perhaps moved there by mistake, so she hurried to call the duty doctor. But when they returned moments later, the bed was empty. The sheets were perfectly smooth, untouched. The doctor gave her a strange look, reminding her that 309 had been used since 2021, after a patient had died there under unusual circumstances. Rabia laughed nervously, insisting she had seen someone, but the unease lingered like a shadow clinging to her skin. Over the next week, her shifts became haunted by 309. Sometimes, she'd walk past the door and hear the steady beep of a heart monitor inside, though the room had no power running to it. Other times, she'd glimpse the same pale figure sitting upright on the bed through the small glass window, staring directly at her with hollow eyes. Each time she entered, the room was spotless and empty. Exhaustion began to wear her down, but the dread was worse than the lack of sleep. The thought that someone, or something, was waiting in that room for her alone. One night, as she checked vitals on another patient, she heard the unmistakable sound of a call bell ringing. She followed the noise down the corridor until it led her, inevitably, to 309. Against every instinct, she pushed the door open. The bed was occupied again, this time with the figure sitting upright. The pale man looked straight at her, his mouth opening as though to speak. Before she could scream, the lights in the room flickered violently, and she heard his voice rasp, "You're late." Her clipboard fell from her hands as the figure leaned forward, his skin peeling at the edges as though waterlogged, like someone pulled from drowning. She fled the room, not daring to look back, the call bell ringing furiously behind her until it suddenly stopped. Rabia resigned 2 days later. When she confided in another nurse about what she had seen, the woman only nodded grimly. 309 is his room, she whispered. He never leaves. Later, Rabia learned the patient who had died there years before had been found under unusual circumstances, drowned in his own bed, as if submerged in water no one else could see. The details shook her to her core, because the figure's decaying face reminded her of something she had once heard in a friend's story, the pale, waterlogged passenger of a midnight bus. She began to wonder if the dead were moving, appearing in different places across the city, searching for ways to return. The classroom that never emptied. In June 2024, a group of university students in Peshawar signed up for overnight study sessions in their campus library, preparing for final exams. Among them was Sana, a hardworking student who often stayed later than anyone else. On one particularly hot night, when the others left around midnight, Sana decided to stay until morning. The library lights buzzed faintly as she took her books into an empty classroom next door, hoping for quiet. The halls were deserted, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old building. At first, it felt peaceful, until she realized she wasn't alone. As she settled into the classroom, the air seemed unusually cold. Her pen shook slightly in her hand as she wrote, and faint whispers echoed from the far side of the room. She froze, scanning the rows of empty desks, but saw nothing. Telling herself it was exhaustion, she forced herself to keep working. Hours passed. At exactly 3:09 a.m., her watch beeped softly, and she heard the unmistakable sound of chairs scraping across the floor behind her. When she spun around, every desk in the back row was now occupied. Pale figures sat there, heads bowed, hands folded on the desks as though waiting for a lesson to begin, her breath caught in her throat. Their movements were eerily synchronized. When one turned its head, the others followed. The figures wore no clear features, their faces blurred as though smeared with water. Sana stumbled toward the door, but it was locked from the outside, though she had never locked it herself. Behind her, one of the figures began to rise. Its chair groaned loudly against the tiles. She squeezed her eyes shut, whispering prayers, until the sound of footsteps approached closer and closer. Then, the voice came, a dry rasp echoing from the front of the classroom. "You're late." The words sent ice down her spine, because she had heard them before. Not directly, but from a friend who had once told her about a nurse at a hospital haunted by a patient who said the exact same thing. Her trembling hand tried the knob again, and this time the door swung open. She bolted into the hall, the fluorescent lights flickering violently above her. For a split second, she glanced back and saw the entire classroom full of faceless students standing now, every head turned to face her. The next day, when she told her professor, he looked uneasy and muttered that the building had a reputation. Students had long whispered about the ghost class that appeared in the dead of night, always filling room 309, the same number she had glanced on the door before fleeing. That detail made her stomach twist. Room 309 again. She didn't return to the library after that night, and weeks later she transferred to a different campus entirely. But the phrase still echoed in her mind whenever she tried to sleep. "You're late." It felt less like a warning and more like a promise. The call that shouldn't exist. By July 2024, Adil, the journalist from the haunted apartment in January, had started piecing together what he thought were unrelated urban legends. After leaving Lahore, he kept hearing eerily similar reports. The drowned passenger on the bus, the patient in room 309, the students in the classroom. Each story carried echoes of his own. The cold air, the knocking, the voice. Determined to write an exposé, he began calling witnesses, tracking patterns, and arranging interviews. His phone was filled with saved numbers of strangers who had seen what most people dismissed as superstition. He told himself it was research, but deep down, he knew it was obsession. One night, while reviewing his notes, his phone buzzed. The caller ID showed unknown number. Expecting another witness, he answered. The line was filled with static at first, then a faint, rhythmic knocking came through. His chest tightened. He had heard those knocks before, back in the Crescent Flats. Before he could hang up, a voice broke through, soft, rasping, intimate. "Adil, you're late." His hand shook as he pulled the phone from his ear. The voice wasn't just calling him. It was calling to him, as though it knew exactly where he sat in that moment. For the next few days, the calls didn't stop. Sometimes the line carried heavy breathing. Sometimes a woman's voice begging to be let inside. Other times, the sound of water dripping endlessly. Once, he swore he heard the echo of his own voice repeating back at him, distorted and delayed. His friends urged him to change his number, but when he did, the calls continued, now reaching him on his new phone within hours. He tried turning it off entirely, only to wake up one morning and find a voicemail, time-stamped at 3:09 a.m., waiting for him. The message contained nothing but a single whispered phrase, "We're coming." Desperate, he reached out to Rabia, the nurse who had fled the hospital in May. She agreed to meet, her hands trembling as she admitted she had also begun receiving the same calls after leaving her job. Even Sana, the student from Peshawar, confessed through email that her phone sometimes buzzed at 3:09 a.m., displaying numbers she didn't recognize. Each of them heard the same words, spoken by the same shifting voices. It was no longer a matter of isolated hauntings. It was a network, something alive, moving across the country through voices, reflections, and numbers that shouldn't exist. That night, Adil stared at his ringing phone on the table, the screen glowing with a number he didn't dial. He let it ring, his chest hammering, until finally it stopped. For a moment, silence. Then the screen lit up again, this time, displaying his own number calling him. The ringtone cut through the room like a scream. With trembling hands, he answered. The voice on the other end was calm, deliberate, and far too close. "Stop running, Adil. You've already opened the door." The line went dead, leaving only his reflection staring back at him in the black glass of the phone screen. The man at the window in August 2024, Sana, the student who had once fled the faceless classroom, moved into her cousin's home in Peshawar, hoping distance from campus would keep the haunting at bay. For weeks, things seemed normal. She avoided late nights, ignored strange calls, and told herself that fear was only in her mind. But one evening, as she studied by the living room window, her cousin pointed at the glass and frowned. "Who's that?" he asked casually. Sana looked up and froze. Outside the window, pressed against the glass on the second floor, was a man's face that it shouldn't have been possible. There was no balcony, no ledge, nothing to stand on. The figure hung there as though weightless, his skin pale, swollen, waterlogged, his eyes a faint, glowing white. His lips moved soundlessly against the glass, forming words she couldn't hear. Her cousin leapt up and yanked the curtains shut, his face drained of color. They sat in silence, their breaths ragged, neither daring to speak. When Sana finally found the courage to peek outside again, the window was empty. But the faint outline of handprints, wet and smeared, remained across the glass. That night, the noises began. Three slow knocks echoed through the walls at 3:09 a.m., the sound reverberating from one room to the next. When her cousin went to check the front door, no one was there. But as soon as he stepped back inside, they both heard the knocking again, this time from the bedroom window upstairs. Sanaa locked herself in, clutching her phone. A new voicemail appeared, timestamped 3:09, though the phone had never rung. Shaking, she played it. The message was muffled but unmistakable. "We're here." By dawn, her cousin was gone. His bed was empty, sheets wet as though soaked in rain. The window beside his room was wide open, handprints streaking the glass from the outside inward. Sanaa fled the house, calling Adil in desperation. Through sobs, she explained what had happened, how she had seen the drowned man with her own eyes. Adil listened quietly, then admitted something she didn't want to hear. "He's following all of us. You, me, Rabia. We opened the door the first time we answered him. Now he doesn't need permission." Sanaa never returned to that house. To this day, she insists the man at the window wasn't just watching. He was choosing. And she fears her cousin hadn't been taken by mistake, but in her place. Every night since, at 3:09, she refuses to look at any window, too afraid of who might be waiting just on the other side. The gathering at 3:09 by September 2024, Adil was desperate. The calls hadn't stopped, and the voice on the line was no longer trying to scare him. It was commanding him. Every night at 3:09, his phone rang with the same phrase, "You're late." He decided he could no longer face this alone. Reaching out, he managed to bring together Rabia and Sanaa in Islamabad, arranging a late-night meeting in a rented safe house on the city's outskirts. It was the first time they had ever seen each other face to face, their stories stitched together through whispers, phone calls, and trembling confessions. The room was tense, heavy with exhaustion and fear. Rabia admitted that ever since she left the hospital, she couldn't enter any room numbered 309 without feeling watched. Sanaa clutched her cousin's missing person report, convinced he had been taken instead of her. Adil laid out his notes, filled with patterns and connections. The drowned faces, the repeating number, the phrase, "You're late." They realized something terrifying. This wasn't just one ghost, but the same presence taking different forms. Wherever it appeared, the world bent to it. Clocks stopped at 3:09, rooms filled with shadows. Voices of the dead were borrowed to lure the living closer. Then, as if mocking their meeting, the lights flickered. Their phones buzzed simultaneously on the table. 3 different devices, 3 different numbers displayed, yet each screen read the same. 3:09 a.m. incoming call. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then, without pressing a button, the speakers on all 3 phones activated at once. A chorus of voices spilled out, layered on top of one another. A drowned woman whispering, a child crying, Adil's own voice repeating, and then finally, the one that silenced them all. Deep, rasping, deliberate. "We are here." The safe house grew cold. The windows fogged as though from heavy rain, though outside the night was dry. Rabia's breath turned to mist. Sanaa clutched her phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. Adil, trembling, forced himself to ask, "What do you want from us?" For a heartbeat, silence. Then the answer came through the devices, shaking the air itself. "You opened the door. Now you must come through." The lights cut out completely, plunging the room into darkness. When they flickered back seconds later, a 4th phone now sat on the table, an old, cracked device none of them had brought. Its screen glowed faintly with a single message, "Meet US. Room 309. The 3 of them exchanged horrified glances. Different cities, different stories, all leading here. It wasn't coincidence. Whatever had stalked them all year had been drawing them to this moment. Room 309, October 2024. Against every instinct, the 3 survivors, Adil, Rabia, and Sanaa, traveled together to Lahore, where an abandoned hospital still stood in silence. It was the same building Rabia had once fled months earlier, where room 309 waited. Their plan was simple: confront whatever force had been binding them, document it, and expose the truth. But as they entered, the air grew damp, heavy, smelling faintly of stagnant water. Their footsteps echoed down the empty corridors, yet every sound felt doubled, as though someone walked just behind them. None of them spoke. They all knew why they were here, and they all knew this would be the last time they ran. When they reached the third floor, the temperature plummeted. The corridor lights flickered violently, and every door they passed bore the same scratched number, 309. Room after room. Each door was identical, though they knew only one was real. Finally, at the very end of the hall, they saw it. A door slightly ajar, a faint glow seeping from within. On the other side came the sound of steady knocking, the same rhythm that had haunted each of them for months. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 knocks again. The air pressed heavy against their chests, urging them forward. Adil placed a trembling hand on the door and pushed. Inside, the room was not as Rabia remembered. It was wider, impossibly so, lined with rows of school desks, bus seats, hospital beds, and household furniture. Each corner of the room reflected the different places they had been haunted. And in every seat, every bed, every shadow, sat a figure, faceless, drowned, silent, all waiting. At the center of the room stood the man they had all seen in different forms, pale, waterlogged, his eyes glowing faintly white. He raised his head slowly, and in dozens of voices layered over one another, he spoke. "You are late." The 3 of them tried to move, but their bodies felt heavy, dragged by invisible weight. Their phones buzzed simultaneously, glowing with the same message, "Welcome home." Rabia clutched Sanaa's hand, whispering prayers, while Adil, tears streaking his face, forced himself to raise his recorder. "Tell us what you are," he demanded, though his voice shook. The figure only smiled, and the room seemed to ripple like water. Then came the answer, spoken in a voice so deep it vibrated the walls. "We are everyone you left behind. Every door you closed. Every voice you ignored. We are already inside." The lights exploded, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the sound of rushing water filled the hall, deafening, endless. When rescuers entered the hospital days later after neighbors reported strange noises, they found room 309 flooded waist deep, though no water source existed in the building. The desks, beds, and furniture were gone. So were Adil, Rabia, and Sanaa. Only 3 phones remained, floating atop the still water, each one showing the same frozen screen. 3:09 a.m.to this day. The building remains sealed, though rumors say you can still hear the knocking if you walk past at night. Always 3 knocks. Always at 3:09. And if you answer, some say you'll find yourself in room 309 too, whether you've been there before or not.